And there we go. All right, good evening. Welcome everybody to our very last lightning lesson of the year. Tonight's topic is Strategy 101. Before we start, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, or the various lands on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So welcome everybody. Good to see you all online tonight. Tonight's presentation strategy is being presented by Vance from Team 3132, as well as various other organizations. So I'll hand over to Vance. Vance, do you want to introduce yourself and then get started on the presentation? Thank you.
Sure. My name is Vance. I am the lead strategy mentor for 3132. And today we're going to have a little bit of a presentation about strategy. Strategy has a lot of different components. Particularly today, we're going to focus on goal setting and how to educate yourself in terms of how do we execute these goals properly. This was mainly targeted to first and second year teams and first and second year students, or sorry, students that have already had 1 to 2 years of experience. But we have a lot of new people today, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of explanation of what the start of the season looks like, because that's where most of these goal settings and thinking is going to happen. So in the beginning of the season, you get a video of the robotics game along with a manual. And in the video and the manual, it will outline what you're going to be doing for the next 6 weeks. So whether that's throwing rings, whether that's shooting balls, whether that's placing like pool inflatables on a hook, it will tell you what your robot needs to do and what rules it needs to follow, like how big it needs to be and stuff like that. Then you'll spend the next 6 weeks building, and then you'll go to competition where you'll compete with that robot. But today we're mainly going to be focusing on that first day where you get your video, you get your manual, and you say, what are we actually going to do? How are we going to build this robot and such? So the first thing we're going to talk about is goals. So goals are the main objective for like, what do you want to get done for the season? So at the competition, do you want to place really high? Do you want to get to the finals? Stuff like that. It's really important that everyone is on the same page when you do set these goals. It makes it so that like everyone's on, like every action has a purpose, saves time, saves effort, so people aren't arguing as much, and it makes it more constructive, so discussions actually have a purpose instead of people going backwards and people not understanding where people are at. Okay, so decisions should also be made with your team's resources that are available to you. So things like time, things like team size, things like experience are all important to consider before you set these goals. Like, for example, you shouldn't make a robot that is super complicated when you're a first year team and you have like 3 people on your team and 1 adult that hasn't done it before. You may not be able to reach your goal and you may be a little bit disappointed at the end. So try to make your goals, whenever you set your goals, try to make them so that you can accomplish them. You can be wrong, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But really, really, really try to make sure that your goals are somewhat achievable. So these are generally or some of the types of goals that you'll experience or you'll hear people talk about at competition. We've split them up into 4 categories for you: tournament, robot, well-being, and award goals. Today, mainly, we're going to be focusing on tournament goals because that's where the game analysis part and reading the manual and looking at the game comes into play. Just to cover a little bit of the other ones, robot goals are things like or attributes you want your robot to have without necessarily looking at the game. So if you're traveling overseas and you want to put it in a suitcase, then it needs to fit in a certain size. Or you want a robot that does the end game that generally happens every year, then that's going to be considered before you see the game. Well-being goals is always super important to be high up there. Having a defined schedule helps you keeps everyone on task. And having no major injuries is also another one. Being safe is also very important so that no one has to go to the hospital that year. Award goals are things like winning impact that you'll see a lot of teams vying for the impact award at competition, especially you'll see judges walking around talking to teams. They won't only be talking to them about their robot, they'll be talking to them about outreach that they've done or people that they've helped or other teams that they've started and things like that. If you're a smaller team and you're trying to win some of these awards, you may have less resources to put into your robot, and your other goals may need to be less ambitious as a result. So that's just something to consider. Okay. So prioritizing goals is important. So if we go back to this list, you won't only have one goal. So let's say if your goal is to get picked for an alliance in the finals, it is not the only goal that you need to have. You can have other goals that overlap. You can have other award goals. You just have to make sure that if you do have multiple, you must prioritize them. Because if you have something come up, then you need to be able to adjust your goals, or you need to be able to say, hey, we can't actually do that. So for example, if a team can't fit a mechanism on their robot, so something like, let's say you're trying to build your climb or your end game mechanism, and it needs to fit in a suitcase, and your design team comes back to you and says, hey, we can't actually fit this on the robot as well as make it small enough to fit in the suitcase, then you guys need to have a team meeting and say, hey, it can't actually fit, and then you guys either need to decide, okay, can we get the robot there another way, or do we take off this mechanism? That kind of goes into saying that the goals may change in the future. So if you do decide, hey, we can't actually ship this in the suitcase, we're gonna have to find a giant box for it or something, and we're gonna have to pay extra to ship it there via big luggage or whatever. Then that is something that can be changed. I would recommend not changing your goals like every single day, but as things come up, as issues come up, you do need to make sure that you have team meetings to make sure your goals stay consistent within your team and that everyone's still on the same page. Okay, so consideration. So we're going into the section where we're gonna look at the game mainly. These are mainly going to educate your tournament goals, and it doesn't really affect your robot goals because your robot goals are done beforehand. It's stuff you really want your robot to do, stuff you think is going to be cool. This is like, we really want to achieve this thing in the competition, and here's how we're going to do it. So this is the scoring table from the manual. So the manual I talked a little bit earlier is the main thing you're going to be looking at throughout the season to build your robot to make sure you follow all the rules, see if your robot can shoot a certain distance, see if your robot can climb a certain height, see if your robot can reach a certain distance forward, so stuff like that. This is the scoring table from last year's game, or this year's game, technically 2024's game, last season's game. It basically lists out all of the points. Because we have a lot of new people, I'll just try to explain a little bit of the table. So in the first column, we have the auto points. I think every season I participated in, and every except one had the autonomous period. And usually, in this mode, robots will move on their own, and you won't be able to control them. It's usually the first 15 seconds of the match. I don't think it's ever not been the first 15 seconds of the match. So it's the first 15 seconds of the match, and usually things are worth more. So if you see this amp note is worth 2 versus the teleop points is 1, which is the rest of the game where you can drive your robot around for 2 minutes and 15 seconds. So for the first 15 seconds, points are usually around doubled. But sometimes it's a lot more, where this is more like times 2.5 from teleop, where you can see the speaker note is 2 to 5 points. In the second column, kind of already touched on it, is the teleop. There's a lot more things that you can do in teleop normally than auto. And they usually include the end game part. So this stage here, this can only be done in the last 15 seconds, I believe, of the match. Or no, you could do it anytime in the match, actually. But there are some years where you can only do it in the last bit of the match to make sure the rest of the gameplay can happen. And this is like usually at the end. Or it's usually an end state thing. So you can see like park here, you have to be at a certain place on the field. On stage meant that you climbed onto a chain and were off the ground. Harmony meant you had like multiple robots on the same chain. There's multiple things usually on endgame. A lot of times it'll have less things than this. I think last year's game was pretty complicated for endgame. So if you do want to take a look at other game manuals and scoring tables, I would highly recommend that you do that to see what their endgame stage look like. Next is the ranking point section. I'll touch on this a little bit later. But essentially, this is the main way that the ranks are determined in the qualification period of the competition. So the competition has 2 sections usually. It has the qualifications period and the finals or elimination matches. So in the qualifications, you'll be randomly paired with and against other teams. and you'll have to play those matches. And if you complete these things, so this melody or this ensemble, then you get an extra ranking point. You can also get ranking points by winning and tying matches. So if you win a match, get the melody and get the ensemble, you get 4 ranking points for that match. Versus if another team only won their match, they would only get 2. So at the end, you'll all play the same amount of games. So your average ranking points, if your average ranking points is above 2, it means you've won plus done a bunch of these ranking point sections, which is really good if you want to rank high. So if that's, well, I'll touch on that a little bit later, but just keep that in mind. Co-opetition, not really something that happens every single year, but it's basically right below ranking points. If your ranking points are tied, then your co-opetition points are what is used to determine your ranking. Okay, next slide. So this is point efficiency or value, depending on what you want to call it. This is how you determine how valuable each action is. So if we go back to the scoring table, in autonomous, if I can score this 5-point ring in auto in the speaker in, let's say, 2 seconds, then that's 2.5 points a second. And you can do that for every single thing on this chart except for the ranking points. Ignore the ranking points. So, and then when you do all of those, you're able to list out, okay, this action has more value than the other one. And then you're able to prioritize that. Or you can say, but sometimes actions are harder than others. So you need to take that into consideration when you determine how hard or how easy something is, or how much point value it has. Okay, so RP, kind of already touched on RP a little bit, but something I want to talk about a little bit more is how do you determine if you should go for RP, if you shouldn't. The most important thing is if you want a high rank in the competition, as I said before, you want to make sure that you try to go for these ranking points if you can. Usually these ranking points are very hard, if not impossible to get on your own. So this 2024's was a little bit hard. So if we look at the bottom left here, these are the ranking points for 2022. They required scoring 20 balls or getting 16 hanger points. The hanger was basically a set of monkey bars that lets you climb up them consecutively to get different amounts of points. They had the, I believe, low, mid, high, and traversal bar. The traversal bar, the highest bar, only gave 12 points, and you can see here you needed 16 points. So it was impossible to actually get it by yourself. So these were some of the things you needed to do to get that ranking point. So if you got traversal bar, your other alliance partner would only need to get onto the low bar in order to get the ranking point. So if you do want to build that, that's something you have to consider. It's like you have to think about how many other teams are going to climb on the low or the mid bar. Is it going to be a lot of the teams? Is it going to be not a lot of the teams? Because if it's not going to be a lot of the teams and you build a traversal bar robot, then there's a chance that you won't get the ranking point even if you spent a lot of this time on this mechanism and you prioritized it a lot. Okay. Action priorities. Kind of already touched on this a little bit in the point value section, but point values allow you to prioritize certain actions. Basically, if you prioritize one action over the other, then that's something you should build towards in your robot. Things towards the bottom of the list you may not get to, or you may not get to build, or you may decide it's not actually worth it to consider at all, and you may just try to save time and focus on everything else that you need to do. Something that you want to consider here is that generally auto or separating auto and teleop tasks is very helpful. So if I go back to the scoring table, if you want to separate speaker notes in auto versus speaker notes in teleop, that's generally very helpful because they are 2 very different actions and require 2 things to develop, because the auto your software team will need to do different things to get that working. Okay, autonomous, kind of already touched on this a little bit at the scoring table, but in terms of planning autonomous, you need to consider how important it is. Generally speaking, it's very, very important. It's usually the highest point density point of the match. So the first 15 seconds, if you watch a lot of other matches, then you'll see a lot of the points just like shoot up in autonomous, and then it'll slow down during teleop. A lot of games, at least in my experience, are won in autonomous. There are a lot of games where the team will score a bunch of things in autonomous, and the other team won't even reach the amount of points that that team got in autonomous. The other thing you have to consider is how many different autonomous programs do you want? These things are important to determine early, because if you tell your software team that you need to have these 3 autonomouses done in a week, they're going to tell you that that's impossible and it's not going to really work out very well. So you have to have these done as early as possible to make sure that they're on the same page, and they're able to write those things early. And when the robot is all done, they can just put it on the robot and get it start testing instead of having to write it all from scratch on week 5. Okay. So another thing to consider in terms of like point value things is timing and cycle times. Cycle times are generally the time it takes to go from one side of the field to the other with the game object and score it. I think in the past, at least the past few years, you've been required to go from one side of the field to the other and score either one or multiple game objects, and that's called a cycle. I think in some years you generally stay on your side of the field and the cycle is a lot shorter and you don't need to go all the way across the field. But the concept is still the same, where you need to go from point A to point B and then score the game object. This is used because you need to determine how much time it takes for you to do a certain action. So if we remember the point value like formula, I guess it's like point value over time equals how valuable it is. So you have to guess, or not guess, but you have to like estimate how long it's going to take for your robot to do all of its actions and score, and then you're gonna divide that, or you take the point value, divide it by that time, and that's how valuable it's going to be. I've had one more thing on this. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, it's good to give a range of times for your cycles, because sometimes you may encounter defense, sometimes you may accidentally hit something when you're crossing the field, sometimes someone will block your vision if like a robot gets in your way, or if you're in a different driver station, it may be hard to see. Those are all things you need to consider when you consider the cycle time. So try to give it a range. If you think it's going to take like 10 seconds, just say maybe my fastest is 9, maybe my slowest will be 15. And then you can take the approximate middle of that and determine how fast your cycle is going to be. Okay. Limitations. These are more so like physical things that your robot is going to have to consider. So in 2024, do I have a picture of the field? I do not have a picture of the field, but you were required, or you're not required, but it was very beneficial for you to go under this stage. So if we look at this green arrow here, you needed to be under, I forgot how short you needed to be, but you needed to be quite short to go underneath this stage. And that's something that you need to consider if you want to do that. So in last year's case, a lot of teams thought it was, including 3132, thought it was very beneficial for us to go underneath this stage, because it gave us another path to the feeder station here where we got our ring so that we can go back to the other side and score. In last year's case, specifically, this orange arrow was never really taken because it's very slow and very hard to see. So if you didn't have the green route, the only route you really had was the yellow one, which made it very easy to defend against. And it meant that our cycle time slowed down a lot because we weren't able to get past the other robot as easily. Okay. So another example would be in 2022, there was the monkey bars like I talked about earlier. Instead of going straight to the highest bar, that was not allowed because you couldn't or you weren't physically allowed to reach up that high, so you needed to go from bar to bar. So it's good to look at that so you don't accidentally build a robot thinking, oh, I can just climb to the highest bar. And that's all you need to consider. And yeah, that's just something you need to look at. These come in all shapes and sizes. It changes like every year in terms of things that you need to consider. But these are generally the two that I've seen the most in these competitions. All right. Physical advantages, these are just small things to, or other physical things to consider that aren't necessarily things that are have to do with the rules or anything. Um, the So things like CG, things like being a small, light, fast robot are things that would be in this list. Things that are not necessarily a robot goal, or that could be a robot goal, but also help with your tournament strategy if that's what you want to look at. So in my opinion, or these kind of come down to opinion and experience. But in my general experience and opinion, lower CG is generally preferred, meaning that you want a lot of your weight at the bottom of your robot. What this helps with is it helps with speed because you can go faster without tipping over. If you have a lot of weight at the top of your robot, you end up tipping over a lot or have to go a lot slower. And if you want to build a small, light, fast robot, for those of you that did compete last year, a lot, I believe, our robot, 3132's robot, and Barker's robot, 4613's robot, was a pretty good example of this, where both robots were pretty small and fast. They require a lot of driver skill, which means you need a lot of practice with it. So you need to make sure that you adjust your goals accordingly to ensure that you have enough time to practice with your robot. All right, I'm gonna put it all together. So previous considerations are used to educate your robot design to best meet your tournament goals. So based on everything that we just talked about in the considerations section, these are used to determine how you're going to best execute on your tournament goals. The biggest example I can give of this is making sure that you prioritize RP if you're trying to get a high rank, or if you want to just go for, I want to be very good in the elimination matches, then maybe you're looking for high point density, which means you may want to make sure that your auto is really good. Robot goals are added on top. So let's say you want to build a robot that is small and faster. Actually, let's take the suitcase bot example. So if let's say you want to build a robot that fits in a suitcase, so you can travel out of the country and go to another competition very easily, then that is added on top of your other considerations that we talked about earlier, and it needs to be made sure that those things mesh together. And then, as we talked about earlier, goals may be reconsidered if the planned robot will require more time and or experience than expected. So if you think you can't build something because it's too hard, or if you think we're running out of time, we need to cut something, then you need to make sure that this is done as a team and that decision is done or is made as a team so that everyone's on the same page and everyone can work efficiently. I'm going to talk about a little bit about our process just to make it to give you a little bit of direction if you're quite new to this. So first, on the first day when we get the game, our team will watch the animation, get the manual, and we will decide on goals before we get too deep into the manual. These can be, I think last year we wanted to rank pretty high, so that's something that we considered and planned for. Analyze the game and come up with robot metrics. So in the consideration section, do we want to go for RP? How important is RP? We got to draw out our auto paths. We got to approximate our cycle time, stuff like that. Then we prototype the relevant mechanisms after we consider all of that. And then after we're done prototyping and getting all the information from that, we then design our robot with whatever prototypes best meet that standard. All right, that is the end of the presentation. But if you have any questions, please let me know and I can answer them. Oh, actually, I think they put the slide after this. If you are I don't know if I can copy paste this link from the PDF, but if you are a newer team, oh, sorry. Wait, what happened?
You stopped screen sharing.
Okay. Why did it open YouTube and then just like die?
We had a similar issue a couple of weeks ago, except we opened YouTube and then got trapped in YouTube forever. So you're just having the reverse experience.
Okay. Well, that was the end of the presentation. I will post a link in the chat, assuming it's still recording. I'll post the link in the chat to the presentation. But it's a presentation by someone named Karthik, who is very experienced in the robotics world and has done a lot of work with teams in especially Canada. And he gives this presentation at Worlds every year that basically goes into a little bit more depth of the consideration section, especially. And he also talks about scouting a lot more than normal, which is another thing that the strategy team does. So if you were expecting a little bit more in-depth content like that, then I recommend watching this presentation because I think he outlines it quite well. All right. But yeah, any questions?
Thanks very much, Vance. I'll give people a few minutes to think about any questions they want to ask in the chat, but while I'm doing that, I'll ask a couple of questions of my own if that's all right.
Go for it.
I feel like the constant battle that we have in the first day or two of build season with goal setting is realistic cycle times. Like we talk a lot about the importance of cycle times and figuring out how many cycle times per match. We often come back later and then basically decide that our expectations were unrealistic and you cannot in fact do a full cycle in 10 seconds. So how how do you recommend teams estimate cycle times with some level of accuracy?
Ooh, okay. I would recommend a couple things. If you are a new team, especially, and you want to have fun, I would recommend you draw out the field either in a parking lot or in a big area with chalk or tape, and you can walk at approximate pace to determine how fast your cycles are going to be. That's a pretty fun activity to do with newer students, especially. I think one year we did it with chairs. That was pretty fun on the field. Um, the more realistic way is probably going to be looking at previous games, and the field always, I think, or no, not always, but in the past like 10 years has been the same size. So you can look at how fast the robots are and the type of drive that you're going to use, and it'll give you a slight approximation about how fast cycle times are going to be, especially with defense and stuff like that. So for example, I think last year when we looked at the game, the cycle was pretty similar to 2017 cycles, except we didn't have swerve drives, which speeds up the cycle time a lot. So 2017 gave us a approximate cycle time of where we were at, and it gave us a little bit of range. So if you can find a game with a similar looking field and a similar looking path, that's probably going to be your best bet in terms of finding your best cycle time.
Great, thanks. In the slides, you had a formula for working out like points efficiency, so points per time, but you were also talking about like comparing that to difficulty of doing a task. Is there any system for rating difficulty, or is this just sort of a decision, sort of a guess that you make?
In terms of like difficulty or in terms of pure points or
Like,
both?
so, like, there's quite a formal system for points per second, like to develop that points efficiency. Is there
Yeah.
something, like, have any teams developed anything equally sort of like formal or mathematical for difficulty per point? Or is this really just like your guess at how complex the system will be?
Not really. The difficulty thing is more of an experience thing. It's gonna be like, because I think last year, if you're really experienced, you can look at something like the trap, for example, and see, or in 2024, because if someone's gonna watch this later, it's gonna look at the trap, for example, and say, that's really difficult. But a unexperienced team or a newer student may look at that and say, I don't know how hard that is versus shooting a ring. But I think some of us here who have done this for a while know that shooting a ring or picking up the ring is probably not going to be as hard as scoring the trap. So it kind of is up to experience. My recommendation for your teams would be attempt or make a solid guess of what you think it's going to look like. So think about, hey, are we going to is this going to be viable for us? And if you start designing the mechanism in week 2 or week 1 or at the end of week 1, and we're like, man, we don't know how we're going to design this thing or make this thing, then it's probably best to come back together and reconsider.
Great. There was a question. It was in the chat sent directly to me though, so I'll just read it out. And I guess this is a
Okay.
good one to relate to that question as well, because like if you're an inexperienced team, and you don't have experienced mentors to ask, like, you know, is this hard or is this easy? Like, where do you go? What are the resources that you look at?
Well, you might be able to answer this question better than I can. But the ones that I know of are, I don't know if, or the Discord, the Australian teams. I'm assuming most people here are on Australian teams, or if not all, everyone is on Australian team.
We
So the
advertise this to the Australians, so it's the available to the Australians and anyone else on our mailing list. So
yeah,
previous participants at SCR.
So the Australian Discord, FRC Discord is generally pretty good. I think people are pretty active in there. The general FRC Discord is a lot bigger. You may get a wider array of responses, but it may be more general and less specific to you. Chief Delphi is another route you want to take if you want to take. One of my friends does that a lot. I think the call center still exists, maybe.
Not very active.
The
The
call
Discord is
center.
probably the
Okay,
best
the call
place to.
center maybe doesn't exist anymore, but at least the Australian team Discord, as well as the general FRC Discord or Chief Delphi is probably my top three that comes to my head immediately. I would recommend using the Australian Discord because if you are a team that's local to some other team, then there's a good chance that they're able to come and even help you out. Open alliance. I don't know.
Which is a suggestion. Open Alliance.
Is open alliance a thing? Does it happen yet? Is it a thing now?
Well, it'll be a thing for this coming season. So Open Alliance is a group of teams that publishes their sort of, I guess, basically their progress over the season. So their initial thought process, their prototyping, how they're progressing. So there's Open Alliance, and then obviously there's also Robot in 3 days, who try and do a whole robot build in 3 days. Do you recommend those as things for teams to look at for inspiration?
Yeah, for sure. I would not recommend, or no, don't listen to me. I would look at them and think about what you can take or can't take from it. If you are a newer team, especially, feel free to copy. It is not bad to copy designs. It will still teach you about trying to put something together because you still will encounter certain problems. It's just that those problems will be a little bit smaller and other people may be or it may be easier for other people to help you solve those problems, especially. But yeah, looking at those, Robot in 3 days or Everybot is probably a good way for less experienced teams to get started and get a little bit in the door without having to like solve really big problems out the gate.
Great. And then just one more question from me, which is we'll go with like a less experienced team, so maybe like a second or third year team. What do you think the ideal like kickoff day looks like? What should your goal be for the end of day one if you're doing a full day?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, assuming you're not a maniac team that wakes up at 4 a.m. And you get up at a normal time, you get in the morning, everyone watches the game to get excited a little bit, and you first set all of your goals. So all of those award goals, tournament goals, robot goals, etc. That I talked about earlier. After you set those goals, probably you can probably set most of them by midday to about maybe like the afternoon area. And then in the afternoon, start thinking about, all right, how are we gonna, you start analyzing the game and you're like, all right, what are we gonna start prioritizing? Are we gonna score? So if we take last year's example, are we gonna score on the speaker? Are we gonna do this in auto? Stuff like that. So by the end of day one, you should have your goals set at least preliminarily. So like they can change in the future, but at least set so that everyone's on the same page. And then you've started looking at what you wanted to start doing, and you should have like a basic idea of maybe like the first like one or two things that are really really good in the match that you want to do, and then everything else is kind of like needs to be decided on another day or after the fact.
And do you think like so that's day one and you decide on your goals ideally on day one? Is there a certain timeline that you think is good for teams to keep to in terms of like revisiting the goals? Like, should you revisit your goals every week, every 2 weeks? Don't bother if everything seems to be going to plan?
I think you can tell me if this answers the question. I'm gonna answer it a little bit a different way, but make sure that the goals are accessible to everyone. So either post it and pin it in a Discord if you're using Discord, or I think you can do the same thing in Slack. If you're using a Google Doc to keep track of everything, then make sure it's in there somewhere. Basically, as things come up, it's probably a good thing to look at and be like, okay, do we need to do this? If when you have your end of night meetings or you have your team meetings, I think every week is probably a good, if you want to do a marker for, it's been a while since we've looked at these. I think every week is generally a good time frame to look at it. If nothing has changed and we're all still on track, we're all still in agreement, then nothing needs to change.
And is there a point at which, like prior to your event, that you need to like take a serious look at everything that's not done and decide if it's going to make it on? Like, is there a deadline, or you just keep going and
Um,
hope that it'll be finished? What do you think?
I I mean, my opinion that never happens is like end of week 4 to like maybe mid of week 5. You start looking at it, you're like, okay, what needs to be cut? But realistically, that it doesn't really happen a whole lot. And I think the people that have been doing this for a while kind of know that. But if you are a newer team or a less experienced student and you do get everyone on the same page and you're like you get everyone to sit down at the end of week 5 or at the in the middle of week 5 and you're like, all right, these things need to change, then um that's really good and that should be noted and you should do that because that doesn't really happen in a whole lot.
FRC teams are eternally optimistic.
Yes, everything is late.
Everything is late. We really hope it's going to make it on the robot. And then the last one is just sort of going back to what you were talking about more towards the beginning. Um, do you think that for uh, newer teams, like I think there's this sort of this conflict between deciding if the win is more important or if RP is more important. So for a team setting out in terms of realistic goals, is it more realistic to say we're aiming to win as many matches as possible, or do you look at the RP, or is the RP too challenging because you're so often reliant on other teams to get the ranking points?
If you're a first or second year team, I would consider not worrying about the RP as much. I would just consider trying to do the most point efficient thing that you can do in the match. Um, Within your capabilities, of course. The RP points are generally there for more experienced teams to have something challenging to do and feel rewarded for, which I think is generally helpful because it means there's less variance in the qualifications. Um, but in terms of like goals that you should set if you are a less experienced team, if you're a first team out here, you have never seen this before, honestly, putting a robot on the field and having it move every mouse is like insane. If you do that and you're a first year team, all of the FTAs will clap for you. Okay. It'll be amazing. So like that can be your goal. That could be your only goal even. If you're a second year team and you've had 1 year under your belt, maybe you can have something more ambitious of like, and you can start looking at this game analysis stuff. Um, but I think that answers your question of like if you're a newer team, don't worry about it too much. Just get something moving. If you're a second year team, then start looking at basic point values. Probably don't worry about RP yet unless you feel like you can. And then as you get more experience, then start looking at do we want to have like do we want to do everything in the match or do we want to focus on RP, etc.
And so, just coming off of that, do you therefore think that setting, like, I guess, consistency or reliability as a specific goal, is that a good idea for teams?
Of course. I think I touched on it very lightly early on. But it's probably best to look at your goals and be like, we don't want to be we don't want to look at our goals later on and be like, kind of did it, like for every single one. You kind of want to like pick the fewest amount that you think you can realistically say at the end, yes, we did it. Um, or this is what we're going to do next time to improve on it. So you really want to make sure that the amount of things that you do is limited to make sure that you can accomplish all the things that you want to.
Awesome. All right, well, that was my last question here. So I'll give a last opportunity for anyone to put anything in the chat. Otherwise, in a moment, I will end the recording. We have succeeded in my goal tonight of having an actual lightning lesson of under an hour, which is very good. That was the joke when we named this series we're calling it a lightning lesson, but none of them were going to be very fast.
Nice.
Last chance on questions, but if not, I'll just say thank you to Vance. Thanks very much for organizing this presentation tonight. I'm sure it was very interesting to everybody listening.
Not a problem.
So really appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah. Thank you to my students who are here who made this presentation. I think one of them is here. One of them is here. Sorry.
All right, well, this is our last one. So, hello, Owen. This is our last lightning lesson for the year. So we'll get this one uploaded to YouTube and shared out a bit later on. But aside from that, I'll end the recording in a sec. And if anyone wants to, at that point, come off mute and say hello or ask a question, feel free to do that. Alrighty, thanks very much, everybody. And I will now attempt to struggle to find the end recording button. Found it. All right, goodbye.